I'm Sarah Coates. Thanks for joining me for this breaking news edition from Israel's northern border. And there have been a number of loud explosions reportedly heard, the result of anti-tank fire from Lebanon, as tensions on the Israel-Lebanon border mount after Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah came out to say last night that there would be attacks on Israel. Now, a little earlier today, the Israel Defense Forces confirmed that a fire erupted adjacent to the border, a result of undisclosed IDF operations in the area, while Hezbollah-affiliated TV Al Manar reported that IDF artillery fire in that same area. Let's bring in our Middle East correspondent, Adi Kopowitz now. Adi, thank you for joining me. You've been covering this tension throughout the week. Tell me, these reports are only coming in just a matter of minutes ago. What more do we know there?
So there's not much to know up until now altogether. What we do know is that the IDF spokesperson announced an anti-tank missile was shot towards Israel. Now, it's too early to say exactly who is behind this shooting, but what we do know is that in past events, Hezbollah is known for very typically using this kind of method to retaliate against Israeli attacks on the Lebanese side. Could this be the start of the retaliation announced by Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah? Could be, and yet it seems still not hurtful, not specific enough. Too early to say exactly what it is. IDF spokesperson has requested Israeli locals 2.5 miles from the border to stay in houses, stay in shelters, and wait for further instructions.
And just bring us up to date with a few of these comments we heard from Nasrallah last night regarding threats to Israel.
So Nasrallah has committed several times in his speech last night that Hezbollah will retaliate and will defend the Lebanese skyline. He's been talking again and again about the Israelis' infiltration of the Lebanese sky territory, guaranteeing that Hezbollah will stop Israel from doing that, because what Nasrallah says is that as soon as Israel infiltrates the Lebanese skyline, it's a guarantee for assassinations on Hezbollah leaders and Lebanese seniors. Hezbollah is responsible, as Nasrallah says, to prevent this, and therefore they want to retaliate, and Israel has to take full responsibility for its attacks.
And tell me, how prepared is the Israeli Defense Forces for such an escalation? We have seen more troops moved in and more heavy artillery brought to the border there. Tell me more.
We've seen a lot of forces deporting to the northern border during the last few days. An interesting thing to remember would be that the chief of staff right now, Aviv Kochavi, used to be the commander of the northern part of the IDF, the Northern Commandment. During last events and during past events, he knows this area very well. He knows Hezbollah very well. He knows the scenarios, and therefore he must be very well prepared for the upcoming events.
And tell me a little bit about, I understand that one of the fly zones has also been heavily restricted in that area for civilian flights.
For several days now, the airport in Kiryat Shmona on the northern part of Israel has been closed. There's a no-fly zone around the border. It's been on and off several times, but it definitely seems like the IDF is taking some cautious steps to prevent civilian vehicles from being in the air that area. It seems like the IDF wants to be aware of every single vehicle in the air in the border area.
And tell me, just how likely is it that this will become a larger area, will be expanded?
We've been hearing from Hezbollah and from Israel during the last 2 days that both sides don't want this to escalate into a war, and yet both sides want to seem like they're the victorious in this case, like they're more threatening, and that they have won this case, that they have said the last word. Now, the question is, how much can each side contain from the other side, and yet say, we're victorious, we contain this, but we're stronger? We'll have to wait and see how it develops.
And, Adi, we are hearing there have been no casualties from these loud explosions, with residents in the north there on Israel's northern border with Lebanon told now to go to shelter. Tell me, just how long would they have when a siren would ring out in the very north there? In
the very north, it's a matter of seconds between the siren sound until the shell fall. When it comes to anti-tank missiles, it's even a shorter notice. There isn't a siren most of the time when it comes to anti-tank missiles because it works differently. We'll see how it develops.
Adi, stay with me. I want to go now to our correspondent, Alec Pollard, who is standing by on the Israel-Lebanon border. Alec, thank you so much for joining me. Tell me, what is the situation on the ground at this hour?
Yes, Sarah, well, we are just north of the town of Nahariya on the road that's leading up to the Israel-Lebanon border and to some border communities that are over there, and the road has been blocked. That happened around 15 minutes ago. We were trying to get to the northern border when there's a roadblock here placed by the IDF, and something of pandemonium, a huge traffic jam. People Why התנתקתי, אחי? התנתקתי.
All right, looks like we're having some problems there with Alec. We will come back to you very shortly there on the Israel-Lebanon border. And joining us here in the studio, we also have our senior international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman. Owen, tell me, it's really a tense time there on the border. What can you expect going forward?
Well, Sarah, no one really knows what to expect, and that's part of the concern here. Again, of course, this coming after that episode in Beirut last week where those Israeli drones, depending on your version, crashed, were able to hit their targets. And again, that attack had been associated with Israel. Again, Hezbollah had promised to retaliate, and maybe this is the retaliation coming. The word we had been hearing in recent days is that Hezbollah planned to, on the one hand, retaliate, and on the other hand, Sarah, do this in a way that it wouldn't lead to an escalation toward a war, something Hezbollah has been pretty clear that it does not want. But again, where this leads, of course, is anyone's guess.
And what about on the Israeli side? We're hearing Nasrallah say that it doesn't want war, but what about Israel, especially so close to an election campaign?
Well, Israel isn't looking for war with Hezbollah, Sarah. It would be a devastating conflict for this country. Of course, we all remember what happened here in 2006, just how much damage that caused across the swath of northern Israel. In the years since, Hezbollah has developed even more missiles and has even more rockets. Again, Israel has tried to keep Hezbollah's arsenal in check through those strikes in Syria, some of which have been attributed to Israel, and recently, of course, Israel having taken responsibility for a few of them. But again, not a conflict that Israel is looking for.
All right, let's now go back to Alec Pollard, who is right there in the area on the Israel-Lebanon border. Alec, we are hearing Israel has fired some retaliatory shots. Tell me more.
Yes, Israel has retaliated with some artillery attacks against those positions from which the anti-tank missile was fired at the border town of Avivim. But we are actually located just north of the town of Nahariya on the road that leads up to the Israel-Lebanese border. And just 15 minutes ago, there was pandemonium over here, a roadblock by the F declaring what's called absorption readiness, meaning ready to absorb some kind of attack. The cars, vehicles were not allowed to continue up north. There was a huge traffic jam over here that's just been opened up right now. Now, this is the remnants of the roadblock with the IDF soldiers right over here. It's now been opened again for vehicles to be driving. Before it was blocked, and we saw some parents coming here and saying we have to get back to our kids. Our kids are at home and we're not, let us through. And they weren't allowed to be let through until literally a few minutes ago. We're also seeing that the IDF spokesperson's unit has said that telling residents to stay in the homes, to stay near shelters, giving instructions what to do in case of a strike. It's not clear if those instructions are still in place or if the threat has been lifted, but vehicles are being now allowed to go back up north and possibly to still be under those restrictions when they reach their homes.
Alec Pollard, thank you. I'll come back to you a little later on. Let's come back to the studio now. And we are, Adi, hearing these retaliatory strikes from both sides. What can we really expect to happen now? It seems like it's really starting to unravel a little.
Up until now, it seems like a very typical scenario of a retaliation from one side and then another one from the other side. Israel answering the Lebanese anti-tank missile with artillery shelling is pretty typical, pretty ordinary. Now, this could develop into something further away. Up until now, we've heard no reports of casualties, and this may be the main factor that affects this. If there are no casualties, both sides can contain this and declare to their own audiences, we've caused damage, we got our goals, we won this round, and go back to their homes without conflict escalating. As soon as there are casualties, the prices go higher, and the chances for an escalation go way up higher.
And what sort of channels are open between the two parties to try and bring this down?
It's a great question, Sarah, and I suspect that there will be those at the United Nations, perhaps affiliated with the UNIFIL force in southern Lebanon, or maybe some in parts of the Arab world, who are able to try to communicate messages between these two, maybe through the United States and the Lebanese government even possibly. But there will be no shortage of groups that will want and parties that will want to try to mediate between these two groups. Again, no one really wants to see an escalation, I think, from either side. I think Adi is absolutely right. To the extent that there aren't casualties, I think this is something both sides will want to try to contain. But again, if there are casualties, then there's going to be pressure again to retaliate from one side or the other.
What is really at stake here for Nasrallah, politically?
His credibility. credibility, and that's why he felt he needed to respond in the first place. Again, the strike in Beirut had been something that he has attributed to Israel. That seems clear in the aftermath had actually been conducted by Israel, and given that Israel had an attack in the heart of Hezbollah's stronghold in Beirut, in south of Beirut, this is something that Nasrallah simply can't ignore and felt he had to retaliate for. But again, Sarah, importantly, the signals coming from Hezbollah, the reports in Arab media, were that he wanted to retaliate, but not in such a way that would lead to an escalation towards a war. Maybe this is the answer that he found he could do.
And tell me, what can we expect now from Israel's top brass? Will we expect now these security cabinet meetings?
We definitely expect a security cabinet meeting. We'll probably hear very threatening, very violent rhetorics trying to warn the other side to not escalate the situation any more further away. We'll wait and see.
And how likely is it, tell me, we know that the IDF has already cancelled the leave of troops there stationed on the border. Can we expect reserves now to be called up? What sort of situation would we have to be in for reserves to be called in?
I think the reserves will have to wait furthermore until there's no firm proof of an escalation, there's a certainty of a full-on confrontation. No reserves will probably be ordered to the north. We have seen a small amounts of reserve into special units on the northern border in the last few days. Not in big masses, though.
And Owen, September 17, second round of Israeli elections, very fast approaching. Tell me, what sort of an effect would an escalation such as we're sort of starting to see here now have on this campaign for Benjamin Netanyahu trying to stay in power?
Well, Sarah, obviously it depends on how things develop. It develops into an all-scale, all-out war, God forbid, then obviously that has an impact on the elections far and beyond what we might imagine, up to and potentially even including postponing them, which has happened in the wake of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. But look, an escalation that's a more contained escalation along the lines of what Adi was describing, in some sense potentially plays into the hands of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, assuming that the Israeli public feels that it's been handled in a competent way. Why, of course, Netanyahu has marketed himself, among other things, as Mr. Security, as someone who has the ship of state in steady hands, and that this country wouldn't want to necessarily risk putting the wheels of the country into the hands of a new prime minister or someone different. It also takes the focus away from other issues that Prime Minister Netanyahu would rather not be in the headlines, such as developments in his investigations and recent news reports about those. So again, the security card traditionally has helped the Likud party. Benjamin Netanyahu can say that it helps him specifically because people will want a steady hand at the tiller. But again, Sarah, so much depends on exactly how things develop. As has been said in recent weeks here in Israel, the news in the northern front over the past few years has generally been good news. Been the news of Israeli strikes in Syria, of a measured but effective Israeli policy in terms of containing Hezbollah and Iran in Syria and even in Lebanon. But to the extent that the situation deteriorates, again, raises the risk of a miscalculation by Israel. And of course, that would rebound very not positively on the Israeli prime minister.
And Adi, you've been spending a lot of time in the north lately. Tell me, how much of an effect does this sort of escalation have on residents in an area such as that?
Well, up until today, we've seen very little effect on the residents. Of course, there are cautious measures that they take according to the IDF instructions, but most of the daily routines go on as usual. Most of them have prepared for the school year that begun just today regularly. We've seen kids playing in playgrounds. We've seen the adults having their regular everyday life. Everyone were cautious. They knew that things might happen. Shelters were open, were prepared, but the everyday routine has continued, which was really interesting seeing in comparison to the fact that IDF troops were moved in big masses very near to these villages and towns on the northern border.
And I understand even tourists have been still flocking to the area. How do you see that? Do you think that's a little funny, especially with, such a huge military presence there?
Not really in the Israeli context there. Of course, it was the height of the vacation season, the second half of August here in Israel, where summer camps are not operating and schools haven't yet started, so lots of families would have already made their plans. Many people, of course, wanting to go to northern Israel, to the bed and breakfasts there, to the holiday camps there, to the hotels there. And the northern border is a beautiful area, so it's a place that families would want to go and visit. And again, Israelis have security situations and escalations so often that people, I think, are going to be hesitant to change their plans, even in the shadow of something like this. Of course, an episode like this one, of course, coming after the August holidays were over, but an episode like this one might well change people's calculations, certainly right up against the border. But in terms of what we had seen up until now, now, again, I think most families here would be reluctant to change their plans for a security escalation that simply might not materialize.
Okay, we are hearing now a development coming through that Hezbollah is claiming responsibility for these shots. What can we expect now from Israel?
Well, once again, we have to say the main factor, the main question here is, are there any casualties? If Hezbollah has took responsibility for this, we will probably hear more claims, more official claims by them of what exactly they were trying to do, and we can see between the lines whether they're seeing this as the end of the saga or is this just the beginning of retaliation. Hezbollah is usually very credible and very easy to believe on their declarations. When they say something, they usually mean it, and we can read loud and clear on what they say if this is the end for them or are they going to continue their retaliation.
And tell me, just how likely is it that if there is a real escalation on Israel's northern border, that this could then trickle down to the south? It's already a tense situation there with Hamas. How likely is it that this would then draw Hamas into a conflict or a confrontation?
Well, Sarah, that's always a concern. And again, you go back to that 2006 war, for example. People forget it's known here as the Second Lebanon War, but that started as a war on the southern front, as an escalation on the southern front in Gaza, and then spread up to the Lebanese border, and again caused real devastation on both sides of the Israeli-Lebanese border. So again, that is a concern here about a kind of two-front war, but one would think that the Israeli military has prepared for that eventuality. And again, it bears emphasizing, and I'm sure it's been said in this studio many, many times, there is simply no comparing the type of arsenal that Hezbollah has, and that the Iranian proxies and that the Iranian military have on Israel's northern border with the kinds of rockets there are in the south. The arsenal in the north is much, much more potent, much greater, and has been much more of a concern for the Israeli military. So the northern front is a real particular cause of worry and concern for the Israeli establishment. The south, there's a sense that it can be contained, that there's something known about the type of threat that Hamas poses. There's something known about what Israel can and cannot do there. With the north, it's much, much more of a wild card, and I suspect much more of a concern to the Israeli military, although, Sarah, the Israeli military will prepare it very, very thoroughly for just this very day.
And tell me, gentlemen, what sort of similarities are there, if any, that you can sort of see leading up with this situation to the Second Lebanon War, which, of course, was in 2006?
The main similarity could be that the escalation in 2006 was a result of a miscalculation. Both sides wanted to retaliate about something. Hezbollah took the soldiers from the border as they wanted to free their prisoners from prisons in Israel, and Israel retaliated very strongly. It developed into a war. Hassan Nasrallah said later on that if he knew that these were the results, he wouldn't go into this action. That's a declaration that the whole situation was a result of a miscalculation, meaning both sides didn't want a war. And in this way, it's similar to the situation now, where both sides don't want a war, and yet they must retaliate to a certain extent and prove that they're the owners of the place and that they control what's happening on the northern border.
And we have seen Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu be very, very restrained over the last few weeks, even months. Tell me, how can we expect him to react now to this escalation?
Well, in past events, we've seen that Benjamin Netanyahu is usually pretty responsible with using the force, the IDF, and using military force on the different fronts. It would be rather surprising to see him change this doctrine completely now, as because of this escalation, he's probably going to work closely with the IDF and listen to the recommendations of the professional commanders in the IDF.
Owen?
I agree. Benjamin Netanyahu has been very risk-averse, as Adi mentioned, in terms of the use of force, and one would not expect that to change here. Again, I don't think in this sense that the elections are much of a calculation. He's risk-averse even when there aren't elections coming up. In some respects, Sarah, all the more so with those elections now less than 3 weeks away. It is true on the one hand that a security escalation, as we just mentioned, could potentially play into the hands of the prime minister politically. But a war is a real wild card, because Benjamin Netanyahu knows just as well as anyone that you know when you're entering a war, but you don't know exactly how you're going to end it or exit it, or what stage that kind of conflict would be at a time of an election. So again, that has always given this prime minister real pause in terms of the extent to which he uses force. Although, as Adi mentioned earlier, if there are, God forbid, Israeli casualties, then that might really ramp up the pressure on the prime minister to respond, and again could lead to a scenario of a miscalculation by both Israel and or by Hezbollah that could end up in a war. Again, let's all hope not.
And tell us just how strong, Owen, is Hezbollah politically?
Politically, they're strong, and more importantly, Sarah, from Israel's perspective, in terms of their military arsenal, they're very strong. Again, There is no comparison between what Hamas has in the Gaza Strip, for example, and the kind of arsenal that Hezbollah could bring to bear in an all-out conflict from Lebanon. The Israeli public saw that in 2006. Again, better prepared for a conflict now 13 years later than it was the first time, because understanding the depth and the breadth of Hezbollah's threat and of its arsenal, but nonetheless a potentially potent arsenal, an arsenal that Israel has taken pains to try to limit through operations in Syria, potentially through this most recent operation in Lebanon, which reportedly had been designed to limit the ability of Hezbollah to produce precision-guided missiles. But again, a potentially violent conflict and a potentially worrying conflict for the Israeli public and for the Israeli establishment. Again, that won't stop Israel from retaliating, particularly if there are casualties. But I do think it gives the Israeli military real pause. And I think there will want to be a sense of calculation and a sense of use of good judgment that there wasn't necessarily in the early days of the 2006 war, where there was a kind of instant escalation by the then top political leadership.
All right, gentlemen, stay with me. The Israeli Defense Forces has just made an announcement. It says, following the reports regarding an incident near Avivim, a number of anti-tank missiles were fired from Lebanon toward an IDF base and military vehicles. A number of hits have been confirmed. The IDF is responding with fire toward the sources of fire and targets in southern Lebanon, adding details. More will follow. What do you make of this statement from the Israeli Defense Forces, Adi?
Well, it seems like it's some sort of a small escalation up until now. Once again, the main thing, the main question is the casualty question. If there are no casualties, the IDF would probably intentionally hit empty targets, maybe damage some of the Hezbollah posts on the border, but it's not going to try and hit Hezbollah people and cause casualties if there are no casualties to the IDF. Right now, it's too early to know if there are any casualties, and if there are, we can expect the IDF to retaliate pretty strongly, although we do have to remember that back in 2015, there were 2 casualties for the IDF in an anti-tank missile attack, and the IDF has contained this in order to finish the escalation. This could happen again. We might see bigger containment abilities than we're expecting in order to prevent a full-on war on this border.
But to amplify something that Adi said, Sarah, you know, when the IDF says that they're firing toward the sources of the fire, that implicitly says only at the sources of the fire, and again implies, that it's a contained response and not something more wide-ranging.
All right, gentlemen, stay with me. Let's now bring in on the phone IDF Brigadier General in the reserves, Israel Relik Shafir. Israel, thank you so much for joining me today. What do you make of this escalation on Israel's northern front?
I think Hezbollah has said that they are going to retaliate, and the fact that they have been shooting at a military post means that they are signaling that it's limited. We don't know if there are casualties, but I would reckon that they wanted to cause some damage, but not cause any casualties, which would force Israel to retaliate in a stronger fashion. So I think this round will be a little bit like the Pakistan-India war, where nobody wants to kill anybody, because once that starts, you don't know where it's going to stop. So limited. They have been taken up on the word that they will retaliate. They have. The IDF will probably hit some or damage maybe some posts or other immaterial targets, and that will probably be the limit. But of course, nobody can really predict when you hit something how it will escalate. But I think, as far as I understand, this is going to be it.
And tell me, what about in the coming hours and of course the coming days? Do you believe that this tension will remain held on the border, or does it really just depend on whether there are any casualties?
Most probably so. Had they wanted to cause casualties, would have fired at Kiryat Shmona or actual civilian targets, and according to reports now, it was directed at a military post, which means that they're saying we're targeting limited targets, and even if somebody gets hurt, it's military and not civilian personnel. And by that, they're signaling that they want this to be limited. The aftermath of the story with drones was such that they were more or less forced through their own storytelling to do this. So this was expected. It happened. We retaliated, and that'll probably be it. A few more days of tension, and that'll probably be it, because nobody really has anything to gain from any escalation.
And we really have seen a lot of rhetoric coming from both sides over the last couple of weeks. Tell me, what is the IDF strategy in this real tit-for-tat battle with Hezbollah?
I think in all the past, both the 1982 Lebanese war and the second Lebanese war in 2006, Israel had miscalculated what the infringement into Lebanon would take and what it would mean. And same is true for Hezbollah. So I think both sides have learned a lesson. When you do not control your emotions or your targeting, then things get out of hand. So I think this is probably, it would be smart to remember the past skirmishes and try to limit the answer whichever way or whichever side.
Tell me, how much control does the Lebanese government have over the actions of Hezbollah?
Well, it's a good question. I don't know if anybody knows, but there is a much more controlling mechanism than used to be in the past, because Hezbollah is part and parcel of the Lebanese government. So this is probably something that was coordinated within the Lebanese establishment. And the fact that they have targeted a military post actually teaches us this, that this is probably the minimum they could do, minimum level they could do.
And tell me, what can we expect from the Israeli Defense Forces in regards to announcements to people on the ground there, to civilians in that area?
I think we can learn from what is happening in the south that any escalation in sending the people underground or so drive up expectations. And so they will probably try to wait out a few hours, see what happens. If everything is quiet, then the tension will de-escalate.
All right, IDF Brigadier General in the Reserves, Israel Relic Shafir, really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's come back now into the studio to our Senior International Affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman, and our Middle East correspondent, Adi Kopowitz. Thanks for staying with me. Adi, tell me, what is the very latest you're hearing at this hour?
Well, we're hearing reports from locals at the north that there's a fire exchange, heavy fire exchanges between both sides. We're hearing about IDF forces targeting and bombing different targets on the Lebanese side near the village of Mabuna Ghas. It's bombing right now. It's happening as we speak. And we're also hearing these first reports from the northern part of Israel about fire exchange, meaning that the Lebanese side is shooting towards Israel too.
And we are seeing live images coming in right now from that area. Adi, speak us through that.
So what we're seeing right now is how the shootings are coming from both sides. Hezbollah has declared that they shot towards military vehicles. We don't have a confirmation for that just yet. The IDF spokesperson hasn't responded to that early. The escalation is going on as we speak, and we'll have to wait for official declarations and confirmations to see how this develops. Certainly,
and it really is, with these sort of escalations and what we're seeing here in these live images coming in from the Lebanese side, it really only is a matter of time before there are casualties. What can we expect? And how many casualties really would it take for an escalation? Can you put a number on that?
It's very hard, Sarah. I don't know that it's necessarily automatic. It may depend on the kind of target choice. But again, I say that with great caution because we have so little real good, solid information about exactly what's going on. But certainly from what Adi described, from what we're seeing, it does look, and we can say this very, very cautiously, like a bit more of an escalation than we had described a few moments ago, a bit less contained, a bit less narrow than we might have thought it would be, given the kind of statement we had heard from the Israeli military, that the Israeli military responding only to the sources of the fire. It does seem to be broader than that, but again, Sarah, we have to say that with great trepidation, because solid information is just starting to come in.
And what can we expect now from Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah? What can we expect? We are seeing these images coming out from Al Mayadeen television there. What can we expect to hear from him?
Well, he'll want to declare victory. He'll want to declare victory. He'll want to show that he has the upper hand in the conflict. He'll want to do that for his base, for his supporters, again, to show them that he is standing up, that he is the resistance, as he likes to call himself and his organization, that he is the symbol in the Middle East of the 21st century, the real symbol of the real resistance to Israel, unlike so many other Arab parties, Sarah, which have decided to move toward more of a reconciliation with Israel, whether that be similar to the Palestinian Authority, which still has very harsh rhetoric towards Israel often, but has security cooperation with it, or whether it be some of those Gulf Arab governments who publicly or not so publicly have also become closer with Israel. He'll want to show that he is the real voice for the Arab public that wants to see opposition to Israel, and that he is doing it as we watch our screens and as we hear this news come in, that he is the one who's actually putting this into action and who is brave enough to stand up to the Israel Defense Forces.
I'd like to amplify that and mention that Nasrallah is considered inside Lebanon. Hezbollah, that used to be an unconsensual organization, is considered today as the protector of Lebanon. They're in the consensus. They're considered a part of the forces that defend the state of Lebanon, not only the Shia people in Lebanon. Nasrallah is very fond of this. He's very happy to have this imagery. He likes to amplify this bigger and bigger. And also, Nasrallah is considered among all the Arab world, including the Sunni countries, as the only Arab leader who has won the Israeli Defense Forces not only once, but twice, in the year 2000 and in 2006. He's considered the big victorious Arab leader. He likes to amplify this effect. And we've already seen declarations from Hezbollah during the last few minutes that this retaliation, this attack on the Israeli border, has been done as a revenge on the Israeli attack on Hezbollah activists in Syria just a few days ago.
And also, we should say, for Nasrallah and for Hezbollah as a whole, this is a way of deflecting criticism at the role that Hezbollah has played often over the course of the Syrian civil war, where, again, it was on the side of the Syrian government against some of those opposition groups who certainly at the beginning of the conflict were more popular in some parts of the Arab world. So, again, he likes to focus Arab attention on his opposition to Israel, less on the way Hezbollah has fought Sunni Arab groups around the region.
And we are, of course, seeing these live images coming in now from the Israel-Lebanon border. The camera there panning around one of the streets, and we are seeing smoke billowing out from behind one of the hills there. Tell me, gentlemen, can we expect Benjamin Netanyahu to convene a security cabinet meeting in the coming minutes or hours? And if he does so, what can you expect to come out of that?
I would think he'll convene the security cabinet. What comes out of it, I would think, is some kind of decision about what to do next. And that's what they'll be sitting there and they'll be wanting to do. What that decision is, Sarah, as we keep saying, depends greatly on what it is that is exactly going on right now, and we're only starting to get the information. They'll presumably have better information than we do, both because of the passage of time and because of their access to the best intelligence that the Israel Defense Forces and that the Israeli intelligence services can offer. And they'll make a decision that hopefully will be a well-considered one. Again, Benjamin Netanyahu, personally known for being risk-averse in terms of the use of force, one would expect that history to be applied here as well. But again, yes, I would expect him to convene the security cabinet. What they decide, again, depends on all those factors.
And Adi, we are hearing now that Hezbollah has claimed it has destroyed an army vehicle. Tell us more.
True. So this is what Hezbollah is declaring. It's part of the amplifying of the effect. Hezbollah is well known for using the media very well for his messages. In past events, we've seen every time that after an attack, and sometimes even during an attack, they release the announcement declaring what they have done. Sometimes they are accurate, sometimes they are bigger than what actually happened. But the main goal of these declarations is to portray Hezbollah as the main military force in the area and to portray Hezbollah as an entity that Israel is afraid of and is being cautious of.
And Owen, tell me, what can we hear from international voices coming in to try and help bring this situation down, help mediate this very, very tense situation on Israel's northern front?
Well, Sarah, we're still in the early minutes of this. I don't know how much international reaction we're getting at this point, but certainly I suspect the international community, sooner rather than later, even if it is a Sunday, even if in the United States it's a holiday weekend, even if everywhere, still the end of summer to some degree, suspect we'll hear international voices very, very shortly, and groups will try to mediate, potentially, particularly the United Nations, various United Nations envoys, the United Nations force that is sitting in southern Lebanon, and Sarah, is supposed to prevent exactly this kind of incident from happening. And they're going to be a real target of criticism, I suspect, over the coming hours and days. But again, potentially they can help to play some role in mediating between the two groups. Again, that's, I suspect, what we'll want to see are calls for restraint from both sides. But again, an understanding that Israel, once it's fired upon across an international border, certainly has the right to fire back, certainly at the sources of the fire and maybe at others that needs to do in order to contain the threat.
All right, gentlemen, stay with me. We're going to go now to our correspondent, Alec Pollard, who is on the ground on the Israel-Lebanon border. Alec, thanks for being with me this afternoon. Tell me, what is the very latest, where you are at this hour?
Yes, well, we're seeing a large movement of vehicles now after that roadblock that took place a few kilometers from here when the IDF declared absorption readiness, to be ready to absorb potentially rocket fire or some other fire on civilians. But now, of course, the big news is the fact that the Hezbollah fired Cornet anti-tank missiles at a vehicle on the border. Hezbollah claiming that they destroyed the vehicle and that they caused injuries. Now, of course, that depends on whether there were people inside the vehicle, whether this was a border car that was driving along the border with people inside it. If that's the case, then certainly, because we've seen pictures that a vehicle was hit. If the vehicle had people inside, and certainly we're going to see injuries and maybe even a casualty. If it was a stationary vehicle, that's a different matter. But we're talking about a very, very serious escalation that we're seeing here, probably the biggest escalation since the 2006 war, which also begun with a similar incident. There was anti-tank fire on a vehicle that killed 2 soldiers inside. Hezbollah actually crossed the border and took those 2 soldiers back inside Lebanon, and that's what instigated that 2006 war. So we're going to have to wait and see if there were injuries, if there were casualties from this attack on the vehicle. If so, then that is something that will have to elicit a serious IDF response if Hezbollah actually managed to injure IDF soldiers that were along the border. And Hezbollah are saying this is revenge for the 2 shaheeds, the 2 martyrs that were killed in the IDF strike in Syria on that Iranian base in Syria last week.
And Alec, it seems like people there in the north are really going about their daily life. Behind you, we're seeing cars driving around a roundabout and pulling into the shopping centre there. Tell me what really needs to happen for these people to be told to go to shelter.
Well, the IDF did give out instructions. That's where that roadblock that we were at beforehand was stopping cars from moving up north, but they gave instructions to the people who were already within the 4-kilometer vicinity from the border down south to be prepared potentially for any type of rocket attack, saying to stay near the homes, that they don't have to be inside the shelter. They can be in their houses, they can be near the shelters, but to be prepared to enter shelter. And also they did give instructions not to go around, to be driving around into roads, not to go near the border. It is possible that the people here are not fully listening to those instructions, but the instructions from the IDF were to stay near shelters, to be ready perhaps for some sort of Hezbollah response, which we saw was a response on IDF vehicle rather than against civilians. That was the response that we saw, and we're still waiting to see if there were indeed anyone injured or maybe even casualties, as Hezbollah are claiming.
And Alec, tell me, over the last few days we have really seen an increase of heavy artillery tanks being moved up into the north. Tell me, what is the situation there now with boots on the ground?
Yes, certainly. We know that the IDF reinforced the area of the Northern Command with extra troops, that they gave an instruction not to allow those troops to come home over the weekend as they usually do, to stay here in full preparedness. We also know that the Iron Dome defense system has been laid out here in the north since last week, and they're also prepared to perhaps try and intercept any type of rocket fire that comes down over here and onto the citizens of northern Israel. So certainly the IDF is in full preparedness for a potential escalation that we're seeing here. Certainly the most tense situation that has been here in many, many years here on the Israel northern border.
And I understand, Alec, that you have spoken to some of the residents on the ground. What sort of a thing do they have to say? Are they fearful, very fearful of an escalation, or is this just daily life in the north?
No, this isn't daily life in the north. Perhaps down south in Sderot, that is more of a sort of daily occurrence. Rockets firing, falling, sirens, people going to shelter, then going back about their daily life. It's much more common over there. The type of escalation we're seeing here up north, that is not something normal, the situation that we're seeing right now. And the difference that we have in the north is that in the south, a rocket can fall once in a while. It can be low scale but continuous. When in the north, it's not like that. If something erupts, it erupts big. If there's going to be an escalation now, and if there's going to be rockets falling now, it's going to be a big escalation. It's going to be a big confrontation. That's certainly something that people here are wary of.
And Alec, we are hearing reports coming in now that Israeli planes have struck an area in southern Lebanon. Tell me, what can we expect now going forward? All right, it looks like we're having problems with Alec's sound there. Let's bring that question here into the studio. Adi, we are hearing reports now that Israeli planes have struck an area in the south of Lebanon. What more can you tell us there, and what kind of response can we expect to that?
Well, we've been also hearing different reports that Israel is bombing a wider and wider area in southern Lebanon. We've even heard reports of Israeli helicopters in the area, which is rather unusual. That's pretty heavy forces for this sort of incident. So we're looking into this, waiting for more reports, and mainly waiting for official reports, because right now we're looking at unofficial reports from locals in the area on both sides of the border, the Lebanese and the Israeli side. We're seeing more and more forces. It definitely seems like the IDF is striking hard on the area of Maroun Aras and Yarun, the Lebanese villages.
All right, and let's go now, Adi. We will bring in a phone call from IDF Reserve's Major General Eyal Ben Reuven, former Deputy Commander of the Northern Command in the Second Lebanon War and former member of the Parliament for the Zionist Union Party, who lives up north. Thank you so much for joining me. Tell me, what is the situation here? You've been in the Second Lebanon War. Tell me, how quickly can situations such as this escalate?
It depends now it depends on the casualties in the two sides, but especially in the IDF. Hezbollah, it's not surprise. The Oliven, it's not surprise. The IDF did a lot of effort to try to prevent Hezbollah from military or civilian targets. I still don't know the results of the anti-tank Hezbollah shooting on the military base near Avivim. And as I understand now, the IDF now react to this, but it depends on the question of casualties. If the IDF has casualties, we can see kind of continuation. I believe that if not, I think that we will see in some minutes or hour or maybe a little more, it will be the end, because the two sides, either Hezbollah and, of course, Israel, don't want to escalate to go to something wide. Again, it depends on the question of casualties.
And Major General, tell me, are there any similarities here that you are seeing that you came across in the 2006 Second Lebanon War?
I don't think, I hope that we are not in the same position like in 2006 when soldiers, 2 Israeli soldiers, were kidnapped by Hezbollah. I hope, and I'm almost sure that we are not in the same position. After the 2006, I personally, as the deputy of the Northern Commander, I faced some events when the Hezbollah shoot after something happened when we had kind of success. They shoot, for example, in 2015, they even killed 2 Israeli officer and soldier, and we, in that time, we decided not to act against. Now we act, and I think that's the right steps. And I hope, again, if there is no casualties, I hope that it will finish and Hezbollah, Nasrallah, do what he said. I mean, he act after what he said about what happened in Beirut some days before. And again, the two sides don't want to widen this situation.
And tell me, if this situation, though, does indeed escalate, tell me, what is the procedure then for residents on Israel's northern border, going over the next few days?
I hope if it will finish, the IDF do whatever they can to bring back the regular life for the residents, for the people. Now they are in their homes. They get orders from the military. They know what to do. As I understand, there is no civilian casualties, and there is a question how it will, how the situation will develop. I mean, today the kids went to school. It's a question if tomorrow they will continue to go to school. I hope, of course, that it will finish, but this is early to give a real answer for that.
And we are expecting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to hold a security cabinet meeting. Tell me, what would be Israel's plan of action following on from that going forward?
It depends on the estimate of the situation. I'm sure that now the chief of the IDF, the commanders, they follow the situation, and they will have to decide and to say to the prime minister what they think about the situation. And again, I said in the third time, it depends on the results. That I don't know the results. It depends, and I hope that there is no casualties in our side, and we act to say to the Hezbollah, this is not the way to act against Israel, and we have to remember that the whole situation now, it's because of the trying of Hezbollah and Iran to develop a new system, very developed munition, that we said there is no way that they will get this kind of munition, and this is a strategic question that we will have to follow and to see what will happen in the future.
Certainly. Major General Eyal Ben Reuven in the IDF Reserves, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Let's bring back in Owen Alterman and Adi Kopelwitz in the studio here. Thank you so much for staying with me. We are, of course, following this very tense situation on Israel's northern border. Adi, tell me, what is the latest you are hearing?
So we're hearing reports of very wide bombings and shelling by the IDF of the area, and we're hearing hearing different Lebanese reports that these shellings or these bombings, the IDF attacks on this wide area, are part of an effort to evacuate the vehicles that were hit. Now, Hezbollah is well known for having the doctrine of an eye for an eye. And as soon as they took responsibility for the people that were killed in Syria, Nasrallah has actually committed to revenging their death. What he meant probably is trying to kill the exact same amount of people in Israel that were killed in Syria, meaning 2 Israeli soldiers. Whether they succeeded or not, we still don't know, but they definitely were aiming for that.
And we are, of course, seeing these live images coming in now from Israel's northern border, the border there with Lebanon, smoke rising up from behind a home there, it seems. Owen, tell me, it seems like there is a real escalation happening. What can we expect to hear from world leaders in response to this?
Again, calls for restraint. And again, it will be very, very interesting and important to hear what we hear from the United Nations. And again, Sarah, particularly from the UNIFIL forces that are positioned in southern Lebanon, and again, I will repeat, are there in order to prevent just this kind of incident. They're there to keep this border safe. They're there to keep Hezbollah away from the border. And yet this has happened. So again, it would seem to point to a real failure on the part of UNIFIL, or at least point to the fairly obvious fact that they're simply outmanned on the ground there and simply aren't equipped to prevent a situation like this. Again, what exactly will UNIFIL do? Will their troops stay in this area, or will they try to evacuate their troops to safety? Will be interesting to see. But again, I suspect we'll hear quite quickly from governments, from the United Nations, from other parts of the Arab world, calling for restraint from both sides, calling for this escalation not to go any further. But again, what are these mediators willing and able to do beyond that? Again, I remind you, Sarah, meetings very recently in Washington with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and none other than Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri, someone who has a very complicated history with Hezbollah himself, but is there as a potentially mediator between the two sides.
What can we expect to hear from Hariri now following this escalation?
Well, listen, sir, you have to remember, Saad Hariri's father was allegedly killed by Hezbollah. So this isn't somebody who necessarily has a great affection for the resistance, as Hezbollah likes to call itself. And yet, as Adi was saying, Hezbollah is so politically powerful in Lebanon that Saad Hariri simply can't ignore them and has to find some ways of having a modus vivendi with them, of working together with them. He will try to calm them down. He will try to dial this back. He certainly has no interest in seeing anything like the repeat of the 2006 war, God forbid, or even anything on a lesser scale. He'll try to roll Hezbollah back, but at the end of the day, Sarah, Hezbollah is much more powerful than him. It's Hassan Nasrallah who's calling the shots here, not Saad Hariri.
And how can we, Owen, expect other Arab nations to address this deepening conflict on Israel's northern border?
Well, that's, of course, what's interesting, Sarah. Go back to 2006, and that was the very beginning of the trend that we have now seen coming more and more into fruition in recent years of Arab states becoming closer to Israel. It was in the opening days of that war where, for the first time, some Arab states were gently not criticizing Israel, and in some senses, very, very quietly taking Israel's side. That was the beginning of the trend we've seen come to fruition. So some of those countries, we may see that again, and we may see them be even bolder than they were in 2006. Of course, on the other hand, there is a feeling on the Arab street, and whenever there's an escalation with Israel, of wanting to see Israel defeated or harmed, of wanting to take Hassan Nasrallah's side. Adi was talking about that before. Arab governments will be under pressure from their public opinions in many cases. But exactly what the Arab reaction will be, I think, in some sense, is one of the unanswered questions. If we are actually headed toward an escalation, I don't know how Adi, what you make of that.
Certainly, we will come back to you, gentlemen, shortly. Let's go now to Alec Pollard, our correspondent, who is standing by on the Israel-Lebanon border. Alec, tell me, how much of this escalation do you believe is linked to Israel's actions in Syria?
Well, it's certainly linked if we listen to what Hezbollah are saying, as they said that this attack on the vehicle is a response to the 2 shaheeds, the martyrs, as they say, that were killed by the Israeli strike on that Syrian, the Iranian base in Syria last week. This is the words of Hezbollah. They've also now come out with an official statement where they are taking responsibility for this anti-tank attack that was against the vehicle that was on the border. And the Arab media is currently going crazy with this and totally covering this and saying that there are casualties, that there are Israeli casualties, that there are perhaps Israeli injured. This is what Arab media are saying at the moment. We haven't heard that yet from the Israeli media, but obviously at the moment they're still holding back with that. But if indeed there are Israeli casualties or injuries from this attack, then that will instigate a serious escalation, will instigate a serious Israeli response. We know already that Israel has artillery strikes against the Marun Aras and Yarun. Those are two villages along the Lebanese border close to Israel, and we could potentially see more responses coming out of Israel to this attack along the border. That once again, if there are Israelis that are injured, maybe even killed from a Hezbollah attack along the border, that is what instigated the war back in 2006 and will surely elicit a serious Israeli response if that is the case.
And Alec, tell me, when can we expect to hear from the IDF and also from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu?
I think we're going to hear very soon something come out of the IDF. Again, if there were no injuries over here, if it was just an empty vehicle that was hit, then by